That threat group never stabilised after that. So that was a very active threat group in our province. After we took the head of the snake off, the leader, that threat group never stabilised to the point of getting good leadership again. So it wilted away and died on the vine.
Welcome to the podcast where we track down Australian war veterans, have a chat with them, and hear their stories. I'm Alex Lloyd, and this is Life on the Line.
They were building positions in there
if
for
anything
a
happened
fight.
to us, by the time anyone got to us,
I think it was
the
chaos.
weather was so bad there would be
I used to
nobody
run
left.
with boots full of blood.
And the next thing I hear was alarms,
Chances of
screaming.
survival were very, very slim.
The soldiers didn't want to go into the ambushes, so they'd send the kids in first. And so he was sent in first into an ambush and he got shot in the stomach.
It was very hard for me, very hard for my family.
And the plane burst into
Proud of the
flames.
crew, proud of what I've achieved and what I'm
To
doing.
volunteer for service was in effect to put your life on the line.
Glenn Kolomeitz is a veteran of the Royal Australian Air Force and the Australian Army. He went from aircraft technician to military policeman to legal officer. He's also a lawyer and a former New South Wales police officer. He's still doing important work in the veterans space. This is his conversation with Angus Hordern.
I'm Angus Hordern, and I'm speaking today with Glenn Kolomeitz. Glenn, welcome to Life on the Line.
Good morning, Angus. Thanks for having me.
Glenn, let's start at the beginning. Tell us about your childhood.
I was born in Brisbane in 1967, the son of a veteran of confrontation, Indonesian confrontation. So Dad was in Malaysia from 63 to 65, had me in 67. Married Mum in Malaysia, so she lived in Terengganu Barracks while Dad was out. Quite interestingly, Dad was out fighting the war, and he'd come home of an evening to the barracks. Grew up in Scarborough, just north of Brisbane. Left school pretty early. Left school after grade 10 because we were pretty broke, I have to say, and I wanted to work. I wanted to start making some money, so did some deckhand time on a mate's trawler and on a mate's dad's crabbing boat before essentially getting into the military to get a trade in 1986. Went from there, had a very diverse military and other career since then.
So growing up, did you have any cadet exposure or any prior military exposure other than your dad's service in Malaya?
I was a naval reserve cadet for a little while, a very short time on the Redcliffe Peninsula in Queensland. That was fun, I guess, but I was a bit, I didn't stay in the reserve space, so not really other than that and Dad.
Let's talk about your dad, Glenn, about his period in Malaya. Dad
was in Malaysia Malaya became Malaysia, of course, from 63 to 65. He took Mum over there and married Mum while they were there, living in Terengganu Barracks. He was a section commander, so a corporal with 3 RAR, Old Faithful as it's known. Dad didn't speak much about his operational service for many, many years. In fact, he was very quiet. He and I were watching a documentary one night on Operation Claret after they declassified Operation Claret many, many years afterwards. And I said to Dad, were you involved in the Claret Op? And he said, of course. This is operating into Borneo and other parts of Malaysia and actually engaging Indonesian forces, which was really an unknown conflict for many Australians. So then Dad started opening up and telling me a lot about his experience. It sort of came to a bit of a head too. He and I and my kids and my wife were at the War Memorial in Canberra, standing in front of this very small confrontasi section close to the Vietnam, between the Korea and Vietnam section, quite historically appropriate, I guess, temporarily. And he was standing in front of a beaten up SLR, a rifle from that period, with a photo of a soldier who was killed. And Dad was staring at this. And I said, Dad, what are you doing? He said to me, quite poignantly, my fingerprints are on that rifle. I said, what are you talking about? He said that he was a section commander when that soldier was killed by an Indonesian landmine in a contact. And they extracted this particular soldier, and Dad grabbed the rifle as they were being extracted. So he then told me for many years, every year on the anniversary of this soldier's death, he would put something in the paper, a bit of a memorial piece. And I walked away thinking that's quite amazing. That was the most intimate account of Dad's combat experience I'd had whilst walking through the War Memorial.
Yes, I mean, that's incredible because I've gone to the War Memorial and met with veterans, and they would share something at the memorial that affected them. Yeah. And I can imagine that would be a very hallowed space for you at the War Memorial, that any time you would go there, that's where you would first go.
Yeah.
Is your dad still around?
Yes, he is. He's in Brisbane,
Yeah, great. So what ultimately inspired you to join the Defence Forces?
Very much Dad, and the fact that way back then he was involved in the early 80s, he was involved in the RSL in Queensland, and I'd go along to the RSL, and I really liked the Anzac Day services and the pomp and ceremony associated with the RSL, which was clearly associated with the military, peripherally. Certainly I liked the Anzac, the marches and the ceremony, so I joined as an aircraft tradesman originally. I wanted to trade too. I wanted to get some sort of skills that I could use later on, and a trade was the most appropriate way. So 1986, I went off and joined the ADF as an aircraft tradesman.
That opportunity that it afforded you then obviously then shaped your life tremendously. I mean, what would you say to young people today that you can still do exactly what you've done and many others have done, that you join the military and you learn a skill and you serve for a while? How did that really help you later in life?
Look, I've been absolutely blessed with not just trade skills and other skills, but a very good education, having left school after grade 10 with not much. Compliments of either Defence or the New South Wales Police. I joined the police later. And so I was given not just the trade, but I was put through the Army Year 12 course. So I was given my Year 12 in the Army. I was commissioned as an officer in Defence as a result of doing that Year 12. And I had a couple of postgraduate degrees paid for by Defence. So look, the opportunities are enormous. Mind you, it's not given to you on a platter. You work very, very hard in Defence, and if you're given these opportunities, I say to young people, take them, jump on them, take the opportunities, but be prepared to work firstly to earn them and then to really justify them, I think.
So let's talk about your work for the pay. You were servicing aircraft.
That's right.
And where did that take you? Where were you based, and were there any postings abroad that came from that?
Yeah, I was based in Amberley initially, and then when the Army took over the Black Hawk helicopter or the rotary wing role, I moved to Townsville with 5th Aviation Regiment. I went from there to New Guinea on a couple of occasions, doing various bits and pieces with certain Army units in New Guinea. Then from Townsville to Oki, which is the home of Army aviation in this country, of course. Everyone that wears the powder blue beret ends up at Oki at some stage. So I went down there with the Black Hawks and the Hueys, the Iroquois. Did a little bit of work on Kiowa, the little Kiowa recce helicopter as well while I was in Oki. From there, I did the Army Year 12 course. I went to Enoggera I decided I wanted to get the Year 12. I wanted the education. I wanted to be an officer. I had reasonable leadership skills as a junior NCO, as a corporal. So I wanted to get commissioned, and the Army Year 12 course in Enoggera in Brisbane was the opportunity to do that.
So Glenn, what's next for you?
I was commissioned. Now, I originally did the Year 12 course with a view to being commissioned into either the SSO, Special Service Officer pilot scheme, or through Duntroon, but I wanted to try air traffic control. I was interested in that area, so I ended up moving into air traffic. Now, around this time, the Army lost its air traffic control role, then the Air Force took it over. So I had to go to the Air Force as an officer if I wanted to do air traffic, which I did. I did Point Cook, East Sale, Richmond. I did that for a few years. I tend to get itchy feet, I think. It probably become quite apparent when we speak about my diverse career, but I left air traffic and I wanted to study law. I really wanted to study law around this time. I had my Year 12, did pretty well, had a bit of a social justice bent, so I wanted to study law. I couldn't do it in the Air Force then. I was pretty much tunneled into air traffic, so I left air traffic, and I wasn't really enjoying that job, to be honest anyway. It was a bit of an office job in a tower, I suppose, and joined New South Wales Police. But at the same time, I went back to the Army as a reservist military police platoon commander, and then military police operations officer and training development officer.
We've been between the reserves and the regular Army, the New South Wales Police. So what made you swap a life in the green for a life in the blue? Yeah,
I knew that I could, the opportunity would be there if I worked hard to do law in New South Wales Police. And I also knew that police prosecutors, that was a very good training ground for practical advocacy, to be an advocate, a lawyer advocate. And I also was interested in the policing role. Not so much general duties. I wanted to specialise, which I did very quickly. But I liked the thought of investigating and prosecuting. And so the police was a very good opportunity for me. And the police, in fact, paid for my law degree. So, and mind you, again, I was working full-time whilst studying, and I gave them a few years afterwards in return, so in pretty demanding jobs. But nonetheless, the police put me through my law degree, which was a fantastic opportunity. I understand they still do for certain police. But so I was trained as a prosecutor, put through my law degree, had some time in the coronial jurisdiction, so working for the coroner, and attached to the coronial investigations team, as well as being a coronial advocate, so counsel assisting essentially. And finally, the counter-terrorism around this time became quite a big issue. It was that sort of era when things were happening close to our own shores. Whilst working for the coroner, I was doing some part-time legal advising on involving counter-terrorism laws, and I'd studied a bit of counter-terrorism in some of my postgraduate degrees by that stage. So I won a sergeant's job at New South Wales Police Counter-Terrorist Coordination Command, which was renamed from Special Branch. It was the old Special Branch. Went there in the intelligence unit, as a sergeant in the counter-terrorism intelligence unit, so advising analysts and investigators, and of course the chain of command, so the assistant commissioner and the commander, in the application of all of this law and policy, and also in looking at briefs and looking at intelligence briefs and looking for essentially evidentiary value in any of this intelligence product.
And then you have a stint as the Defence Policy Advisor for the Shadow Defence Ministry.
Yeah. I went to, I was given an opportunity. I was approached by Robert McClellan, the Shadow Defence Minister at the time under Kim Beazley, and I told Robert I'd give him up until the 2007 election to help rewrite Labor's defence platform leading up to the 2007 election, which I did. So I gave Robert a solid year of actually giving the Labor Party some real-time defence and national security policy advice from a known platform, so from somebody who had studied and applied this stuff. And whilst there, I completed a Master of Defence Studies through ADFA, so again, another opportunity came up which allowed me to have a deeper dive into that strategy and policy space whilst in Canberra working for Cleland. So that was a good opportunity, a very hard job working as a staffer, particularly leading up to an election and a change of government. But I think helping to rewrite Labor's defence platform then was very good. It was a very good step for me.
And I think also putting party politics aside, Beazley's known as one of the best, certainly one of the better defence guys we've had. To serve under a capable minister and then his department thereof would be quite productive and worthwhile.
Absolutely. And in fact, what impressed me about Kim Beazley, I went to brief Kim on 2 occasions in a pretty dynamic environment. One was surrounding East Timor. We had some intelligence come in that a group of ships were gearing up to deploy, one of which was a frigate. Frigates, the rest were transport vessels, but frigates provide area-air defence. I went to brief my boss, McClelland, and said, look, they're clearly going to Timor. Transport vessels plus a vessel providing area-air defence. Clearly it's for Timor. Kevin Rudd, he thought it was for Fiji, but there was not any prospect of an air threat around Fiji, so you wouldn't take a frigate for that sort of a task. So I went and briefed Beazley about Timor. Beazley accepted that, and that afternoon, John Howard, the Prime Minister at the time, announced we were going back into Timor, and Kim Beazley was ready with a response. The second occasion was Afghanistan, getting ready to go back to Afghanistan. I took a map of Uruzgan province to Beazley's office, sat down and briefed him on Australia's force structure or disposition in Afghanistan at the time, and its likely force structure disposition. And what I liked about Kim was he listened intently, asked very sensible, well-informed questions, which you could just tell his mind ticking over. He knew what I was saying, he knew what he needed to know, so he could go into that chamber, into that parliament, and speak with an informed voice about our deployment. So, look, very impressive man. I was very proud to brief Kim Beazley.
I can always remember Kim Beazley when he was running in the election. He was flying over from Perth to Sydney. And what I liked about the man was in his hand was Les Carline's book on the Anzacs.
Yeah.
And that said a lot about him, that he took, in particular, the nation and our defence. And again, I think you were fortunate to serve under a good minister.
Absolutely.
So, leaving politics, you dust off your military uniform and you return as a regular army as a legal officer.
Well, I came back in, I was still a military police officer at that time in 2007. My wife and I moved to Wagga because Emma was she's a GP now, but she was, I think, an intern then, or a registrar intern then, and she was a rural, intended to be a rural GP. So she moved to Wagga. I obviously went with her, and the opportunity came up to do full-time reserve work. So whilst there, I transferred from military police to legal corps as a reservist, and then very, very shortly thereafter back in the regular army.
So your duties there then lead you later on to East Timor again.
Timor in 08, 09. I had a couple of Christmases in a row away from home, which is pretty standard. But so I was in Timor 08, 09 as the legal officer, which was a very interesting time, I have to say. It was obviously a few years after the what I would call the combat phase, so the interfet phase, and it was after the initial UN Untayet, the transitional phase. But it was still when I got there, it was a fairly dynamic environment. We, not long before I got there, some grenades were thrown over the fence into Camp Phoenix, the Australian base in Dili, and there was still evidence of the fragmentation on the wall there. So they were still on quite a high security stance when I came into the country. I was in body armour, helmet, rifle, pistol. By the time I left 6 months later, I was getting around town in a baseball cap and my 9mm pistol. So in 6 months, that is Australia and New Zealand, had helped stabilise that country incredibly. Very busy job, very, very busy job as the sole legal officer. A lot of my role was key leadership engagement, so engaging with government in Timor, plus the Portuguese, plus the UN and many others.
I think people also need to realise that in modern warfare today, the legal officer has quite a different role to how we could perceive a legal person here at home, in that you've got guys that are engaged on the front line quite literally, set with their rules of engagement. And things always change, especially after the first shot's fired. Consequently, you are then involved as to how they can react, what they can do. Yeah. Can you elaborate a bit on any circumstances around that?
We're actually engaged a lot earlier than that. If we're doing our job properly, we should be enabling these troops to do their job, and not saying what they can and can't do, but enabling them to do their job within the left and right of arc of the law, so within the bounds of the law, the rules of engagement. So we should be in there training them during their force preparation and giving them in-theatre training, practical scenario-based training, getting out there with them, as often as we can, just to sort of help steer them through certain issues, but also then addressing their concerns. And I'll speak about Afghanistan shortly because there were some very significant issues I had to address there during my tour, during my 2 rotations there, my summer 1 tour, 2 rotations. But you're actively engaged from day one in that rule of engagement, law of armed conflict space. So very dynamic role, to the point that I've heard as a criticism, incidentally, referred to as the lawyer with their finger on the trigger. That's how intimate it's how close you are to the actual engagements, and that comes in very, very significantly in Afghanistan in the dynamic targeting, the drone prosecutions, so the drone strikes, which I was involved in.
So Glenn, let's go to Afghanistan then.
Sure, yeah. I went into Afghanistan with the first rotation with a reserve commando company out of Melbourne. This was during what they call the non-fighting season, so the winter rotation, which was interesting. It was most of my role there, again, was ensuring that the rules of engagement were understood and applied appropriately and advising on them. And this particular company I went in with, they were a bit lawyer shy, sadly. They were involved in an incident on their earlier rotation involving some grenades and the deaths of some children and some subsequent prosecutions, disappointingly. So this particular company weren't particularly open initially to engaging with the lawyer, which I could accept. I was there as an enabler, so I helped them as best I could. It was my next rotation, which was with what they call Alpha and Bravo, so an SAS squadron and a company of regular commandos during the fighting season, where it became very, very dynamic and very engaged. Both the squadron and company commanders would actively seek out my advice during their operational planning, and even if they didn't, I would be there anyway. That's the nature of the beast. You've got to make yourself involved. And their subordinate commanders, their platoon commanders or their patrol commanders would come to me for advice. I'd get contacted from the field for advice, and I'd be out in the field doing certain tasks. I spent an enormous amount of time on both rotations, really, outside the wire, probably more than any one individual soldier, to be honest, because I was one lawyer acting by myself, but engaged in the extracting detainees from the field, extracting evidentiary material from the field, escorting detainees to Kabul for prosecution to hand over to the Afghan government. watching live feeds in the operations room of our troops in the field, going to meetings in Kandahar to argue the point with the ISAF, some of the ISAF chain of command, about how our troops wanted to apply the rules of engagement, that we're operating under two lots of rules of engagement, NATO and Australian. So obviously some discrepancies came up, and I'd have to go and fight the case, prosecute the case for the way we wanted to apply certain ROE. So very active in that area. But I think very critically, this is a big point. This goes back to that finger on the trigger piece. Australia has prosecuted, as we know, it's public knowledge, some Predator Reaper drone strikes on some key top-tier insurgents, some insurgent leaders, one of which was on my watch, so during my first rotation. So how it works is that my job as the lawyer is to essentially look at all of the intelligence product and look at all the information and make sure, one, we can lawfully target this person. There's going to be zero risk of civilian casualties, so that collateral damage piece, and make sure we can actually prosecute this serial. So in this particular case, I won't name the objective, the insurgent, but it came down to the commanding officer, the intelligence officer, and myself looking at the product, the drones on frequency, so the drones up there ready to go, live feed to the location where this insurgent was, and the CO turned to me and said, "Glenn, can we do this?" And my response was, I ticked off all the boxes legally and temporally and geographically to ensure that the risk was minimised, of the risk of collateral damage. And I said, "Boss, we're good to go." Next thing, within a very short time, within seconds, it's happened, and there's a puff of smoke, and the job's done. The target was prosecuted, and incidentally, that particular prosecution, that threat group never stabilised after that. So that was a very active threat group in our province. After we took the head of the snake off, the leader, that threat group never stabilised to the point of getting good leadership again. So it wilted away and died on the vine.
I can imagine that it would be incredibly frustrating for the guys in the field having to prosecute the law and just care for the people and do their work, and then be in a position where they can remove one of these hostile elements, and then to be able to do it to the extent that we don't accidentally have some collateral damage, that someone else is in the way or something. You must have experienced great frustration with people in that process who would be saying, let's do it, and you've got to say, the law says we can do this. Yeah.
I never actually said, I made a point of this throughout my military lawyer career, and indeed as a military police officer, but more so as a lawyer. I never actually said no to a commander. No, you can't do this, boss. I always said, these are the risks with doing that, and these are the options to do it within the bounds of the law, so in a lawfully defensible manner. And I think commanders, these particularly special operations bosses, they appreciate that. The lawyer is an enabler, and even though we do have the red card essentially to say no go, I found that my commanders, my special operations bosses in Afghanistan, respected the fact that I was there to enable him to do his job. And therefore, if I had said, and we'll use that drone strike as an example, if I had said, "No, boss, we can't do this," he wouldn't have gone ahead with the prosecution, prosecuting the target, I'm sure, because he wouldn't have had it legally ticked off. So they like the fact that I'm there to protect them, as well as myself, of course, and the troops and the civilians and Australia's reputation by keeping that close eye on what's happening.
And I can imagine in any service period there are always those lighter and funny moments. Can you share any of those?
Yeah, this is interesting. During the winter rotation, one of these particular special operations soldiers from Melbourne had these guys grow beards when they're deployed in Afghanistan. That's the nature of the operation. Had a big white beard, and so he was out in the range one day on top of a vehicle with a bunch of automatic weapons in a Santa costume, but with his battle rig, so his chest rig and all his magazines, etc., over the Santa suit and his rifle, but with this Santa suit on and his natural white beard. So I got a photo of that, and it was just a great image. But then years later, I was presenting to a little group, my little bloke at his preschool and their little friends, just showing them on an Anzac Day thing, showing them some photos of Afghanistan and Timor. And I showed this photo of this Special Forces soldier in his Santa costume, armed up, bombed up. And I said, "There's one of our soldiers in Afghanistan at Christmas." And one of the little kids went home to his mum and dad and said, "Mum or Dad, Santa is a soldier and he's in Afghanistan." And so the parents come back in to see the teachers at Little Cherubs, this particular preschool, and said, "What's going on? You're telling my kids that Santa's a soldier and he's in Afghanistan." Well, they showed the parents this photo that I had, and clearly Santa was a soldier to these 4-year-olds, and clearly he was in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Interesting.
In 2010, you retire from the regular army and you go back into Civvy Street to pursue your legal career.
A bit later, 2010, I was posted to Canberra as a military prosecutor. So I worked for the Director of Military Prosecutions, prosecuting courts martial and Defence Force magistrate cases around Australia. I did that until very early 2013, at which time I had to leave. I was running for the Senate. So I was on Labor's Senate ticket in an unwinnable spot, but nonetheless, I was on the ticket and I had to therefore leave the regular army. It was time to leave anyway, I think, to be honest. It had been, I had a couple of very, very demanding deployments and a very demanding caseload coming into prosecute. I was an experienced prosecutor, so needless to say, and an experienced deployed lawyer. So my boss, the brigadier, gave me a lot of the more intense operationally related, as in deployment related cases. So I had some very full-on courts martial to prosecute. Did that for a while, came back and then got out.
I would imagine that the court martial process, though, of all the sort of work you can do in the courts, wouldn't be a particularly pleasant one.
Particularly the nature of the cases, they're never pleasant. I had a lot of sexual assaults and indecent assaults and quite big frauds early on. And then later on, I had some cases involving incidents that occurred on operations overseas. One of which, interestingly, and again, this is public record, so I can speak about this, was a matter involving a group of military police men who were involved in some fraudulent dealings with detainees and in the processing of detainees in Afghanistan. Now, the boss gave it to me, the brigadier gave it to me, one, because I was fully aware of the nature of the work in Afghanistan. I was not long out of there myself. I was fully aware of the nature of the military police detainee handling role because, one, I was an ex-military police officer, and two, I was the detainee handler in Afghanistan. So the brief came to me, but I found myself prosecuting, and without fear or favour, of course, but prosecuting a group of military police soldiers and an officer for this fraudulent and very messy dealing with detainees, with captured insurgents. So these men were all convicted and appropriate punishments were handed down. But that was a very demanding case. But again, you prosecute on the evidence before you without fear or favour.
You leave the military and you're back in the legal system.
I went to the bar. I went to the Northern Territory bar initially as a barrister because I wanted to just do court work. I wasn't a big fan of the paperwork side of lawyering. So I went to the Northern Territory bar with a view to practicing up around the territory. And my wife was a rural and remote GP by then, so she was pretty keen to get back up there. But I found myself quite very quickly drowning, and I'll use that term quite literally, in a lot of veterans' mental health related criminal work and administrative appeals from decisions of Veterans Affairs, but predominantly this PTSD related or mental health related criminal work. I was getting veterans or their families or their mates coming to me saying, look, I'm in trouble with the police, or my husband or whatever's in trouble with the police. He has, they're all men. I didn't have any female clients in this space. He has chronic PTSD. We've got no money. Legal aid won't touch us. Can you help him? This is all around New South Wales. So I found myself staying in New South Wales to pick up all around the state, to pick up these PTSD-related mental health cases. They were all pro bono free. Not the best business model, I guess you would argue, but nonetheless, it was out of necessity rather than desire. But later on, it became out of desire because I saw the need, this critical need, and I didn't want to see any more veterans going to jail where they could otherwise be diverted into treatment. So something like 102 cases, I think, we've run. 100 of those were successfully diverted out of the criminal justice system into mental health treatment. The charge goes away, they're diverted out of that system, and zero recidivism rate, so no repeat offending, which tells me, one, the diversion works. Two, these people should never have been in the criminal justice system in the first place. And it begs me to ask the question, how many veterans are in jail around New South Wales and Australia who have mental health conditions who perhaps should have been diverted?
Yes, well, that's a discussion all of its own.
Absolutely. Out of necessity, my practice had to become exclusively a pro bono veterans practice. So early on, a number of administrative appeals before the AAT, the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, against decisions from Veterans Affairs. And that's a whole other line of lobbying there that I've had to get into because I think some of the Department of Veterans Affairs decisions are just terrible and the processes are a disgrace. I'll put that aside for the moment. But the PTSD, mental health related criminal work, I was inundated with these cases to the point that I was travelling all around New South Wales, and my best mate, who was an ex-commando, ex-Special Forces soldier, I met overseas and we'd sort of done other things together, is now a law and commerce student at Wollongong Uni, and he's also the Vice President of RSL New South Wales now, Mick Bainbridge. Great bloke, sharp as a tack. He and I began representing these veterans around the state in these mental health related criminal cases. And whilst it doesn't pay the mortgage, it certainly helps me sleep at night, and it certainly gives me a feeling of putting something back. Doing the right thing. At the end of the day, doing the right thing for these men and women, but they're mostly men, as I say, who we've sent overseas, we've put them in harm's way. We've therefore contributed to their adverse mental health outcomes. They come back to Australia and, unsurprisingly, the wheels come off and they're out by themselves. I do not want to see any more veterans going to jail because of that mental health nexus when we can get them into treatment.
And fortunately, your wife is still pursuing her medical practice work?
That pays the mortgage. Yeah. I have the most...
I was just trying to think how the money was working in this family. And I think, in fairness, you've been blessed with a good marriage, clearly.
Absolutely. Emma's a rock. Emma's followed me from base to base over the years when she was an intern and a resident registrar, etc. So she's been exposed to, obviously, being near military bases. There are a lot of veterans or serving people and therefore a lot of mental health cases. So Emma's been exposed to that veteran space, having followed me around from location to location as well. So it's sort of given her that opening into the veteran space, but very supportive, absolutely right.
And again, it's another discussion, but very little is said about the women and the men who marry the serving ladies in the forces today, but particularly, the ladies that follow their men and they live on these bases in the most remote of places. It's the most Spartan accommodation. It's not the harmonious urban life that the average housewife or gentleman would aspire to enjoy. So good on her.
Can I give you a quick story about that, just very quickly?
Please.
Emma, I went to Afghanistan. Emma was in Wagga, so away from her family, working at Wagga Base Hospital, I think as an intern then, and pregnant with our first child. I was supposed to be home in time for the birth, but I got a phone call one night. I was about to board a helicopter to go out in support of an operation. So I was bombed up. I was ready to go. Emma rang and I said, look, can I call you back in a couple of days? I've just got to go out and do something. She goes, no, the baby's coming. And the baby came in quite trying circumstances. Emma had what they call HELP syndrome. So it's severe preeclampsia, as I understand it. So not in the best state. They had to do an emergency Caesar. So I delayed my departure on the helicopter, but I'm sort of walking around the base, not knowing what's going on around Tarancot, around Camp Russell, rather, around our unit. Emma's gone in for an emergency cesarean. I get a phone call from her dad saying that Emma was hemorrhaging. So both Emma and the baby had to be flown back to Westmead Children's Hospital by air ambulance. I can laugh now, but at the time it must have been horrendous for Emma. Husband's in Afghanistan. She knows I was sort of pretty busy. She's in this place, undergoing this birth in trying circumstances. Both Emma and Nicholas were fine, but the end story from that is I came home a few weeks later, turned up at Sydney Airport with all my green equipment, my boxes, and all my gear, unshaven, long hair, looking quite feral, having just spent one night in Dubai on the way home, the Al Minhad Air Base on the way back, to this brand new, clean little baby still with his little ankle and wrist straps on. So I'm crying at Sydney Airport, bawling, But you're right. That just shows how the partners really wear the brunt of our service, I think.
Equally, you're waiting to receive this call to hear she's okay, and there's a helo literally waiting to pick you up and deploy you, and how you have to switch on and be 100% for the troops you're with. It just really highlights how difficult warfare is always terrible and it's always difficult, but I can certainly see the difficulty in this story. So, Glenn, you're now running Glenn Kolomeitz Lawyers. How do people get in touch with you if they'd like to use your services? They
seem to have no trouble getting in touch with me. It's less frequently the actual veteran themselves. It's more often the partner or a friend or something saying, contact Glenn. A lot of these blokes, and I say blokes, again, mostly men, are too proud to reach out. And particularly too proud to reach out to a military lawyer with whom they may have served, a former military lawyer with whom they may have served. In fact, I had one Vietnam veteran who got caught up, joined a motorcycle club and got caught up in a little bit of nonsense there. He said to me that in his plea in mitigation, part of his biggest shame was having to reach out to a former army lawyer to help him out. So Look, but they can contact me. I'm trying to grow this network because it's a very big caseload, and it takes an enormous toll, I have to say. Every case is horrible. Every case is mental health related, so it takes its toll. I'm trying to build the network and get more lawyers out there actively involved in the pro bono veteran space. There's a lot of lawyers prepared to do pro bono work for the Cat Protection Society, and a lot of very honourable lawyers doing refugee work, and that's great. Pro bono refugee work, that's great. But how about we start putting into this veteran space? And there's very few of us. I've got 2 or 3 helping me out now in New South Wales, very few of us doing this. I think it's a good pro bono commitment. You've
also done some work with one of our previous guests on this podcast, Jay Devereaux of Veterans 360.
Jay's a great bloke. I've never met a more dynamic, veteran-focused person who's not a veteran himself. It's amazing. You would think he was, because this guy is just so focused, and his partner Tessa, they're so focused on their mission. I met Jay when I was at RSL, and Jay came to me and wanted help funding what he was doing. Veterans 360 is what I call the mission beat of the veteran community. They're out there actively identifying veterans at risk of homelessness or currently homeless, and providing what we call a wraparound welfare service, not just giving them a roof, but the whole spectrum. And it's gone beyond that. It's gone to that Jay referring some of these people to me when they're caught up with the coppers. Homeless people get caught up with the coppers. That's the reality. And homeless veterans are no different. Right? So we're providing this holistic service, this wraparound service, and Jay made that organisation. He's grown it, and he's an incredibly knowledgeable guy in that homeless space. I understand he was homeless himself many years ago.
Yes. Look, your work and Jay's work and many others is no different to typical Australians who are predominantly self-employed business people. We like working for ourselves, doing our own thing. That's what we're best at.
I understand Jay has engaged with a couple of businesses who are now providing some money to his mission, supporting Veterans 360. So that's a really good outcome.
Looking at this amazing career where you have a habit of doing so many different things so often, I'm sure we're going to be hearing about you again in the not too distant future. Thank you very much for joining us today, sharing your amazing story. It's a story of service, and it's a story of love and compassion for your fellow veterans, and we thank you for it.
Thank you very much.
This is a revised edition of the original podcast. Saving Our Veterans with Jay Devereaux was one of our early bonus episodes last year. Be sure to look it up and find out more about the great work of Veterans 360 Australia. Our website is www.lifeonthelinepodcast.com, and you can also find us at that name on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Look us up and give us a like or a follow. Life on the Line is brought to you by Thistle Productions. Artwork by Big Cat Design, music by Dan Van Werkhoven. Thanks for listening, and lest we forget,